what happens is we have this gap as experts in that it all seems so obvious. The Heath brothers, Chip and Dan Heath, coined one of my favorite terms in their book called Made to Stick. They coined a term called the curse of knowledge, which is that we forget what it's like to not know. And I think that is, if there's one thing that I'm working with all the time, it's the curse of knowledge, which is that we get so involved as the experts in developing our material, our findings, doing the research, that we put the data out there and it seems obvious. And so being aware of the curse of knowledge, I think, helps to combat it. Ask yourself, I'm not just listing or giving this finding, but am I interpreting it for my audience?
Hi everyone, this is David Paull, and on this episode, I'm talking with presentation expert and TED speaker, Melissa Marshall. Melissa has committed her career to helping scientists, engineers, and researchers present their findings in ways that are meaningful, engaging, and inspire people to take action. Melissa is a faculty member with the Department of Communication Arts and Sciences at Penn State University, and her TED Global talk, titled Talk Nerdy to Me, has been watched more than 2 million times. In addition, Melissa has lectured at Harvard Medical School, the New York Academy of Sciences, and the CDC. In this conversation, we discuss how to distill down your message by continually asking the question, so what? How to best use slides and visual aids when presenting data, Melissa's universal truths for crafting and delivering effective presentations, and a lot more, so check it out. Hey, Melissa, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, David. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
It's my pleasure. Me too. So for people who don't know you, tell us a little bit about your story.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a communications professional who wandered into the world, if you will, of science and engineering and the challenges that scientists and engineers experience with communication. And I wandered in and never wandered back out. Because I realized immediately that this was an area that, as a communications professional, I was incredibly passionate about, and also saw so much opportunity to make a difference in helping the people, like scientists and engineers, that are doing important work, helping them to translate that work to those that might be outside of their field. And so that's how a little bit about how I got into this and sort of what my role is. It was kind of an interesting journey. So I spent 10 years of my career as a faculty member in communication at Penn State University. And while I was there, I was responsible for teaching public speaking and presentation skills classes. And what happened fairly early on in my career is that the colleges of engineering and the colleges of science came over to communications and said, hey, we could really use some help with some really targeted classes for our science and engineering students to make sure that they're doing a better job, because some of the feedback they were getting from employers was that the students were doing a great job on the technical side, but needed to do a little bit of a stronger job explaining some of their research and their design ideas. So I was the person that kind of bubbled up to the task there and became the one who developed some of those courses. And so that's when I say I wandered in. That's how that happened. I was sort of happily teaching public speaking courses at the university level, and then got this extra task to develop a specialized course for science and engineering students. And so that was really, I would say, for me, my proving ground in terms of really developing and researching a lot of the techniques and strategies that I now teach professionally to scientists and engineers across the world through my coaching company, Present Your Science.
That's an amazing opportunity. Sounds serendipitous that would have come.
It certainly was.
And then it's turned your career in a whole new direction.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it certainly, I would say that getting, responding to that initial, that initial inquiry of, hey, we've got this need for a specialized class. I certainly, when I responded to that, had no idea that I was, responding to the thing that I was really meant to do. Because the first time, I'll never forget the first class that I taught a whole group of engineering students. I was both scared, but also as soon as I started to talk with them and realized what they were trying to get across and how important the work was, I was completely just totally hooked. from that moment, I said, this is exactly what I'm supposed to be doing as a communications professional. And, and then, serendipitously, I think, and maybe some of the, a way that maybe your listeners have come across some of my work the way that most people have is that I also had that opportunity to give a presentation from the TED stage, which really helped to get that message out to a broader audience beyond my Penn State group.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So yeah, your TED Talk was at TED Global 2012. So I have a couple questions for you about that. One of them, well, the first one is how did that come to be? How did you end up on TED's radar and get that speaking slot?
Sure. This is, 'cause I think an interesting story, and that I suspect it's a bit unexpected from how people normally think of how people arrive at the TED stage. So typically my understanding is that to present at one of the main TED events, of which there's two, there's the regular TED and the TED Global, to get to one of those stages, typically it's people that have already, have a book or have done something, really significant in terms of spearheaded a major project. I mean, these are people that are really out there already, and TED sees them in the news or wherever and says, yeah, this is somebody we should have come and talk. My journey was a little bit different in that, as some of the listeners may or may not be familiar with, so there's something called TEDx events. You've probably heard of them, David, I'm sure, which are the independent TED events. And the reason that that's significant to my story is that Penn State wanted to have an independent TED event that they called TEDx PSU. And the way the independent TED events work is that if you want to have one that is of a size larger than 100 people in the audience, you have to have a special license from TED to use some of their branding and those sorts of things. And so in order to do that, and Penn State did want to have, it's a large university, they wanted to have a large event. And so you have to have a license holder. And at the time I was advising that student organization that was trying to get this, sort of off the ground, because I was a TED aficionado, I think from a very, very early start. I had been using those in my teaching for years. And so when some students were, getting excited about that was something that I became involved in supporting the effort. And so it turned out that in order to hold the license, one of the requirements to be a licensee from TED is that you have to have attended one of those two main TED events so that you become a bit more familiar with the style of the event. And so Penn State said, hey, we'd like you to go so that you can, qualify to be a license holder. I said, sure. It was the easiest yes I ever did in my life, which was sure, I'll go attend the TED event. Right? No, and so the next one coming up was TED Global in Edinburgh, Scotland in 2012. And so I was all signed up just to go be an attendee. I was extremely excited about it. It was a total dream come true. And then I get an email. And this is something I did not know was a thing. But for that conference that year, and I don't know if they've done it for other conferences, I assume they have. But there's an email that went out to all attendees, essentially saying that they have a couple of, I call them wild card spots, which are basically they have a spot or two open that attendees can pitch an idea for one of those speaking slots. And I thought, well, hey, I mean, this is already a once in a lifetime opportunity. I'm going to be there. I was at that point very deep into my work at Penn State with teaching scientists and engineering students. And I thought, I'm passionate about this message. I feel like it's one that maybe needs to get out there. And so I just sent in responded to the little application. And lo and behold, I went through several rounds of interviews and, selection process. And I was selected for one of those wild card spots. So that's how I ended up on that stage at a fairly early stage in my career. So that's how I ended up there, which is a pretty neat opportunity.
Yeah, I'm also a big fan of TED. We actually did some work for the annual TED event in 2011 with our Dialsmith group, where we worked with them to dial test some of the TED Talks. So that was also an easy yes, where they asked if we would be a part of it and help them out, and we couldn't say yes fast enough. So and then when TEDx started to grow, I live in Portland, Oregon, and TEDx Portland is one of the largest U.S.-based TEDx events, and I think I've been to the last 5 years of those. So I'm also a huge fan. Your talk was amazing. We'll link to it. No one will have trouble finding it, of course. I think to kick everything off, you kind of had me at the title. So where did Talk Nerdy to Me come from?
That's funny. That's actually how, when I was thinking, because this email came in kind of saying, pitch your talk idea. And so I was, had been, kind of, things sort of marinate in your mind. And, I had been kind of thinking about it. And I was like, I wonder if I should try to pitch some sort of a talk. And so I had been thinking about it. And I was actually driving to work that day. I remember exactly like the point of my road to work, where it jumped into my mind, this idea. So the title was the first thing that I developed for the talk, actually. And it for me, it came out of nowhere in the idea, because I was really trying to figure out how to strike the right tone, which I found to be difficult for that message, because I wanted to have something that was fun and lighthearted. I thought that was important, because I also know that I thought the message might be a bit challenging. And so I wanted to do it in an uplifting and positive way. And so I was really thinking about, what the title might be that would convey both the challenge and the opportunity, but also the bit of the fun part, which for me, and just it's sort of my personality, how I like to approach the things that I do. I wanted to make sure that the talk was me and what I was trying to get across. So the title was actually the first thing that came across to me, and I asked a couple of people about it, and ultimately I said, does it seem fun? Does it seem like it works? And it got pretty good responses right away. I thought it was a bit of a risk, to tell you the truth, just because it was a bit edgy, depending on what circles you're in. But I felt like I felt good about the choice, and slapping that right at the top of my application, because I thought that it stood out, and I thought that it conveyed a bit of the fun approach that I wanted to take with what I also thought was a valuable and useful message.
Clearly it's spot on. You know that now, these years later, the kind of feedback I'm sure you've gotten, but it was a stroke of brilliance for sure. It was great.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Well, like I said, I wasn't sure at the beginning, but it worked out.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm curious, and I'm sure a lot of other TED fans will be curious. What's it like once you're in that ecosystem? You've been selected. You're going to talk. What's it like when you're kind of in the eye of the storm there? How would you describe the experience?
Terrifying and awesome. So, for me, I found it, so I say terrifying because remember that at that time, my main job was as a public speaking faculty member at Penn State University. And so I believe that there's, nothing closer to career suicide than being a public speaking teacher that flubs their TED talk, right? I mean, I was riding the plane over, and I was like, boy, if this doesn't go well, I was thinking about what are my other career options, and things that I could that I could do. So that's the terrifying part, is that I felt like the stakes seemed especially high, for just because I'm a public speaking teacher, I should be able to pull that off. And so that was one thing. But I would also say that it was awesome because I was personally, through my experience, just beyond impressed with the TED organization. I felt like from start to finish, from the second that I was selected until I stepped foot on that stage, I felt really supported. I felt really encouraged. I went through, quite a lot of revisions with the TED team of my talk. And what I was most impressed by, and I had no idea what to expect, I had no experience in that realm. I was most impressed by how dedicated the folks that I worked with were to making sure that I gave my talk, not a talk that they wanted me to give, but what was the talk that I wanted to give, what was important to me. And then they just helped me to give me feedback on how to make my message the best that it could be, which I think is an important distinction, because I actually expected there to be a little bit more, hey, we really think this would be like the right, angle to take on this, or we think this would be, and we think about the theme of the conference, maybe you want to say a little bit more about this. And I didn't really get that from them, which to me was a surprise, and pleasantly so. I really, when I was having my questions and my, my revision from them, it was very much just, how can we help support you to make sure that you give the message that you want from that stage. And
Mm-hmm.
so I found that to be really, really great. So, for me, I felt like I gave the talk that reflected myself, and I felt like I had the full support of the TED team to develop that in a way that was useful for what I wanted to get across.
Yeah, well, that's great to hear. That's certainly the way the organization seems, and it's great to hear that that's what it's like behind the scenes. I also think that's what lends to the popularity of TED and TED Talks being so engaging, because they're authentic to you or to the other speakers, and not what you're being shoehorned into trying to be in order to fit the theme of an event or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And I have to say that was a surprise. I was sort of prepared to, have my talk be molded, thinking that they might have, the curators might have a certain direction or that kind of thing. And that was really a surprise. And, the other thing that I think stands out, we talked about being in the eye of the storm, if you will. I will say that it was, from a speaker perspective, very much something that they emphasized: the practice, the preparation, the dress rehearsal. I mean, there were very few surprises. I would say the 24 hours leading up to my moment on the stage were very carefully managed. And I mean that in a good way, in terms of, there was a very, an important dress rehearsal that, for me, actually, by the way, went terribly. And so I found the dress rehearsal to be incredibly difficult. And so I was still kind of struggling at that point. I had a really short time slot, and I was still struggling to get my content into the time slot. And, but I felt like there was very much a sense that they didn't leave a lot to chance. I mean, it really was that they were making sure that the speakers were prepared and were ready. And that was interesting, to me, because as a speaking coach or a speaking teacher, I was trying to absorb that experience on two levels, and I had to, remind myself each day. I wanted to absorb it. I had to absorb it as a speaker, because I had to deliver, on a big stage. But I was trying to also parallel process and run something secondarily in my mind, which was, how are they doing this from a speaking and coaching perspective?
Right.
And really what I learned from that, which didn't come particularly as a surprise, is that practice and preparation matter. It's the number one question that I get asked all the time. I mean, how can I present better? How can I give a talk like that? Or if somebody will see, me or someone else present that seems comfortable, that's always what they want to ask. How can I do that? And I always feel like I don't have great news, because people really want a magic bullet type of theory. They want, like, here, do this one quick trick, and then you'll be comfortable and confident when you present. And for me, it may just be my style, but I had to work at it. To feel comfortable on that particular stage, I practiced and prepared a lot, and Ted conveyed that to me as an important strategy.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. Last year, I gave my biggest talk to the largest audience that I've spoken to, and it was much different than anything I've ever done before. And I committed myself to practice, and it felt unnatural, because I've been in sales and marketing my whole career, and I talk to people all the time, and I'm pretty comfortable off the cuff, seat of my pants. But I just knew that up on that stage with the spotlight on, in a room full of people who, in my mind, are probably judging me from the minute I walk out, I need to do everything I can to train my mind to not blank out on me. And the practice and preparation just made me so much more confident. And it wasn't so much about memorization. I think you can over memorize and put yourself too much into a box. You would know far more than I would in your profession. But for me, it was really just becoming really comfortable with the material and the sequencing and the key words and triggers that I knew I had to say in order for the rest of the train of thought to come together.
I couldn't have said it better myself. That's exactly right. I think that that's always a hard nuance to strike when you're trying to, because I can't emphasize enough how important preparation is for a big talk, but that's different from memorization, which is, for me, the thing to be avoided. As soon as you start to memorize, it's extremely dangerous, because when you memorize something, that actually puts you at quite a high risk of that blank out occurring, and then you have nothing to go on. I think it's most important that you really just truly know your material. And it's okay if you lose a bit. You may lose, a piece here or there. You may have a little bit of a stumble, but actually that's, I believe, more natural and more positive than something that feels like it's being rotely memorized and recited. So I think there's the trade-off in the natural flaws, if you will, are worth it, because the audience feels as though you're actually talking to them instead of reading a script from your mind.
Yeah, absolutely. It humanizes you. And I've taken cues from comedians who've either had a joke bomb or have lost their way, and the way that they use their natural sense of humor to be able to be self-deprecating, diffuse that situation, get right back on track. And I think it endears the audience to them even more than if they hadn't had the mistake.
Yeah, I completely agree.
So let's turn this back to your area of specialty. Taking your years of public speaking experience and coaching and the lion's den of a TED Global talk, and focus that on making scientific presentations or data-based presentations more, as you say, meaningful, engaging, and inspire people to take action. So what were some of the things that you were surprised to learn as you got into that space? And what are some universal truths that have really unfolded for you over the years as you've been coaching people?
Universal truths. I like that. That's an interesting way to think about it. I think that what surprised me the most, and surprised me both in terms of how much need there is, and also now that I'm still doing it this many years later, how I still am surprised that I'm still having to target this so specifically, and that's the use of visual aids and PowerPoint and slide design in scientific talks. I was surprised when I got into it how poorly it was done, meaning, and when I say poor slide design, I would define that as text-heavy, bullet-laden slides.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how I would think of that. And I was quite surprised to see just how entirely prevalent that was in the technical field, how entirely ineffective it was, and yet so prevalent. And I've been this is a drum that I've been banging for since I started in this work. I believe that this is the place that we simply must have. We must have a significant shift and significant change in order to improve the quality of scientific talks. And I continue to be surprised that this is still a conversation that I have to have with lots of people in lots of big corporations, small companies, universities, top tier institutions. I mean, this is to me a really fundamentally broken part of our system that I thought by now, actually, especially given how rapidly our technology is changing. I mean, look at how visual our world has become when you think about what you see on the screens that you hold in your hands or that sit on your desk.
Mm-hmm.
And then I am amazed at the disconnect that when it's time to stand up and talk, that we're really using this medium to simply do exactly the same thing as what we're doing when we speak, which is to deliver content in a word-based scenario.
Yeah.
So that to me has been a continual surprise. The flip side of that, and this is what I would say, if there are any listeners that are in a field where you're trying to convey complex domain-specific knowledge. I mean, I happen to work in science and engineering, but I think that many of these ideas translate well to complex, specific domain expertise. And if that happens to be someone who's listening, I think that the good news here is that this is low-hanging fruit. If you are courageous enough to challenge the status quo when it comes to what you put on your slides, meaning that you're willing to show up with a slide that maybe doesn't look like the one that everybody else in your company has designed, that everybody else at the conference has designed. If you're willing to be so bold as to think instead about what I call visual evidence on your slides, and that's a term that comes from my fabulous mentor at Penn State, Professor Michael Alley. He's a lead researcher in the area of slide design, and he uses this term visual evidence, which I use in my work now as well. But that, to me, if you're willing to really leverage the visual qualities of your slides and to get away from the bullet points, you have a huge opportunity to stand out in a positive way, because this still is something that has not changed all that much in those fields.
I'll put you on the spot. Let me know if you're able to come up with something for us. But do you have an example that you could walk us through of a case where you took something that was that text-heavy, bulleted visual aid and helped someone rework it into something that's more visual evidence-based, something more tangible that we can wrap our heads around?
Sure. So the way that I like to think about slides is think about having your slide do something for you that your words cannot. I think that that's a really important way to think about it. So if you have a message you're trying to convey, then you're thinking about, okay, what would be the visual way to do that? And so I believe that what a lot of people do when they start to hear me talk about this is that they look at an existing deck that they have. And that's almost actually a little bit in the nature of your question, which is, okay, I've got my traditionally designed deck. Now I'd like to do it a little bit differently or a bit better. And so I'm going to do a one-to-one transformation. And actually, I believe that that's the hardest way to do this, believe it or not, because the simple act of designing via a bulleted list in PowerPoint actually pollutes the way that you think about the material. Because the second universal truth that I've learned in helping scientists and engineers to communicate about their work is that the devil is in the details. And that goes both ways, meaning that you have to be precise, but you also have to not overwhelm. And I believe that so many scientific presentations are compromised because there are too many details. I mean, they're simply so overwhelming. There are so many pieces of information that the audience can't really figure out what's critical, what's important, what's actionable. And as a result, they do nothing. And I believe that a big culprit of that, why we've ended up in that place, begins the moment that somebody sits down, opens up PowerPoint, and begins with that master template that says, hey, type a phrase title at the top and then support it with a bulleted list. And so as soon as that happens, I believe that the thinking has from that point forward been, in my mind, it may be too strong of a word, but it's what I believe. I believe that the thinking has been polluted. I think it's incredibly difficult to back out of that. So to get to your, to more specifically what someone might do, and this is what I have coached many people to do, which is to step away from the slide design software for a moment and ask yourself, what are the messages? And now I talk about takeaway messages. You could call it storylines. Some of the research calls it assertions, whatever it might be. But I like the idea of takeaway messages. At the end of my talk, what are the takeaway messages that I want my audience to have? And I think a good rule of thumb is no more than 1 per minute of talk time as a kind of an upper threshold, which I think can go lower and less the more complex your content happens to be. But sit down. If you've got a 15-minute conference talk, I might coach someone, what are 10 takeaways about the research? Once you have those takeaway messages or those storylines, that's now where I would ask you to say, okay, so if you're trying to convey this result, now you are in a good position to say, what's the visual evidence for that takeaway message? And usually, once you start thinking that way, there's 2 things that happen. First of all, you are now at a much more filtered and focused level of thinking about the material, because thinking in terms of takeaways is a much deeper level of thought than thinking simply as a topic or a phrase. So just that shift changes the thinking of the presenter, because you have to, by nature, to do a full sentence takeaway, you have to be specific about what it is that you're saying. When you add that subject and verb, it adds some specificity that a phrase simply does not. And then once you have, now you're more filtered and focused on your message, and now you can start to fill in what would be visual evidence for those takeaways. And they actually lend themselves usually quite well. I mean, people do charts, graphs, tables, diagrams, photos, videos, icons. I mean, there's tons of things that work well. And ultimately, if you get, and this is the number one, one of the huge things I get asked is, okay, that's all well and good, because I think that you'll find that as soon as you start thinking that way, most of the visual evidence lends itself, like it kind of comes up, okay, I need to, I need to support a result. Here's a graph. I need to show up, support this description. Here's a photo. That all comes together. And then you're always going to get to one spot where you're going to be like, oh no, there's no visual. And this is where people, and this is always the question I get. Sometimes it's asked in panic. Sometimes it's asked as a gotcha question, actually. Well, I have this one thing where there's just no visual. And what I would tell you, I'd tell the listeners, is that that's actually not a crisis. Do you know what that's telling us? That's telling us that at this stage in the talk, a slide is not necessary. And so I would put forth the radical idea that it might be entirely possible that at some point in a presentation, the strongest thing that you could do is blank the screen and simply talk. You know, there is nothing that says that we cannot communicate powerfully at stages of a presentation without a slide. And that, I have to say, is an idea that is the world of science and engineering kind of a crazy one. I mean, people will look at me like I've grown a second head when I suggest that maybe for 30 seconds or a minute in their talk, the strongest thing they could do is to simply describe what they were seeing in the lab. So I think that that's the process. So that, when I'm thinking about how I would walk somebody through it, and that's exactly what I do. So I hope that's a process that maybe your listeners can avail themselves of as well.
Absolutely. And I think another thing that listeners to this podcast face a lot, because a lot of them work in market research, customer insights, and so much data gets presented in charts and in graphs. And it's trying to figure out whether you're delivering it verbally or whether you're putting it into a report, and you don't want to have a 30-page graph-laden report that just ends up on a shelf. What are some tricks and techniques to be able to turn data-based findings like that into visuals that are more compelling, more memorable, easier to digest or share?
Sure. I would say that, and it's, I might add a piece that it's not just turning it into the visual, but to me, the two go hand in hand. The visual is secondary to the right message. To me, it's the supporting, the supporting cast. So I think that the shift that at least I'm, currently advocating for is that I believe what we have, in whether it's reports as you described of, what your audience is often responsible for, or whether it's, standing up and delivering findings or a project update. I think that what we often have is we have communicators or presenters that are givers or listers of information. So we have come up with a lot of stuff, call that the research, all right, whatever it might be, doesn't really matter what field you're in, but we have got stuff. We've got facts, we've got findings, we've got information. And then what typically happens is that to give a presentation or to write a report, we become a lister or a giver of that information. And here's the shift that I think is what our audiences are really desiring. And this is why I think the gap is happening, is that the communicator, the presenter, the writer, whatever it might be, the communicator is saying, hey, here's all the stuff, right? Here's all the information. I am giving it to you. And what the audience wants is they don't want a giver or a lister of information. What they desperately want from speakers, I believe, is for speakers to be interpreters of that information. And to become an interpreter, I think that the all-important, most critical question, and you should ask yourself this a million times as you are developing a talk, and answer it while you're giving the talk, and that's the question, so what? I think that when you look at findings, when you look at the reports you're trying to convey, when you look at the visuals that you're trying to design, ask yourself, so what? And ask yourself, so what, more than once about a particular item. So, okay, we have this finding. Well, so what? Right? And answer that for yourself. And I actually like to do an exercise that I'll do sometimes with people in my workshops or when I'm coaching, is that I almost take it to a point of absurdity in terms of, just keep asking that question. So what, so what, so what, until we get to the most top level of what we're doing. And, example, I was teaching just yesterday, giving a workshop at NC State University. And there was a researcher in that audience that essentially designed, to my understanding in the first pass, as he was describing it to me, he designed algorithms for flight simulators. All right. And so he had described to me, and there was a very fancy name that I don't recall, for these algorithms, for these flight simulators. And so I said, well, so what? And he said, well, And the answer to that was, well, pilots are actually in many cases no longer or not as often trained or recertified on actual planes. They are instead recertified on these flight simulators.
Mm-hmm.
But we need to make sure that the algorithms, right, are responding appropriately. And I said, well, okay, so what? Right? So they're retrained on these. Well, then it turns out that the shift that has to happen, the reason that matters is that we need the simulators to respond very quickly and in a real, in the same real life scenario that an actual plane might. And that's why these algorithms are, this innovation is so important. And then, of course, I said, now I'm starting to get it. Okay, I get why we want to, train pilots well and have the simulations be appropriate so that they're learning, how something would actually respond. And then the final so what, and this is probably a level that you maybe wouldn't need to go all the way to. But then I said again, so what? Well, it's so that our pilots are keeping us safe in the skies in real world situations. But that's an example of, we came up actually 4 levels of trying to go from the jargon-laden finding or, piece of information, and now we come all the way up, and now we have a couple of choices in terms of how we can interpret that information for our audience. And so I think that exercise of the so what, and then you can then decide based on who your audience is, which level is appropriate. I mean, do I only need to come up one level of so what? I just need to ask it once, and that gets me to an appropriate interpretation. Or if I've got an audience that's really, very much outside the field, then you may need to ask yourself that question 2 or 3 times to get to the right interpretation of the data. And it's interesting that exercise is not particularly difficult to do, but it is incredibly illuminating that's what's missing, because what happens is we have this gap as experts in that it all seems so obvious. The Heath brothers, Chip and Dan Heath, coined one of my favorite terms in their book called Made to Stick. They coined a term called the curse of knowledge, which is that we forget what it's like to not know. And I think that is, if there is one thing that I'm working with all the time, it's the curse of knowledge, which is that we get so involved as the experts in developing our material, our findings, doing the research, that we put the data out there and it seems obvious what the so what is. And so being aware of the curse of knowledge, I think, helps to combat this idea of, or this temptation to be simply a lister or a giver of information. So if you're aware of that, and I think the way to combat it is that ask yourself, I'm not just listing or giving this finding, but am I interpreting it for my audience? And I think a way to get there is through that so what questioning phase.
That's a great technique. And it also endears you more to your audience and lets you craft a story and a narrative out of these incredibly complex things and findings that scientists are trying to communicate. If you take flight simulation algorithms and you reduce it down to, ultimately, we're doing this because it will save lives. It will help pilots keep passengers safe in the air and help them handle difficult situations. And then if you work back from that ultimate extreme that we can all connect with, I think it's a much easier path then to people being interested and open and willing to process what starts to become a lot more complex and difficult to grasp.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, this has been fascinating, and I can't thank you enough, not only for telling us your story, but for giving us some real tangible, tactical takeaways. I know this is what you do for a living. It's a real gift to our listeners to be able to take your expertise and apply it to their work immediately. So I really want to thank you for that. And we will absolutely direct listeners to your website and certainly to your TED Talk. I cannot recommend that more highly as a way to spend a little bit of time and really learn what your work is all about.
Well, I want to thank you for the opportunity to come on and to share a few of these ideas with your audience. And I certainly hope that it's helpful for them in whatever presentation situation they find themselves in, that they're able to really seize that moment and convey what's meaningful and important so that their work has the impact on the audience that they want it to have. So thank you for having me, David.